All right, you're good to go.
All right. Thank you so much, Jackson. This is an exciting time to be speaking to everybody. I realize this is part of a bigger series than just an individual class, and this is such a important summit that you all do every year. I'm thrilled to be a part of it, and talking about what I love most, which is permaculture and foodscaping and edible plants. So I will start off with a quick introduction to what custom foodscaping does. Basically, we operate a lot like a landscape design and build company, but we specialize in food production and growing things like food forests and kitchen gardens, orchards and foodscapes. So we work with clients anywhere grass will grow. We are helping people grow food and installing and maintaining those landscapes. So to get us started for this evening, I want to talk about permaculture first, which is one of the operative words of our presentation title here. Permaculture is kind of this elusive thing to define, and for me, I like this very simple definition, which is nature-inspired design. So permaculture at its core, it's all about design, and it's and what makes it so important, I believe, is where that design inspiration comes from, which is the natural world around us and the ancient systems that have evolved for millennia, and those systems are the ones that we know to be the ones that take care of this planet, the ones that support life on Earth and provide for all of our needs. And it's really this recognition and reverence that we need to desperately tap into that ancient wisdom and start to understand how we can harness the power of all that evolved brilliance and use it to make our lives more hospitable and more abundant on this planet. I think that nothing for me has felt more connective than this image that we see here, which is on the left here, the picture of these tree rings, and then on the right, the picture of our fingerprints, right? And I think that it's such a simple idea, but one that I think can't be said enough, which is this reminder of the interconnectedness and just how close we are to the plants that are around us, the plants that are harnessing the sun's energy and making food for all living things here. So I want to set the stage with that, and I want to jump into this, which is the most inspiring place that I have visited in the St. Louis area. And many of you have probably seen this place. This is the Shaw Nature Reserve. And I think Shaw is just absolutely spectacular, not because just because it's beautiful, but because of the type of beauty that I witnessed there, which seems to just be so what our climate wants to look like. It just feels good. It feels right. And there's so much diversity. And one of the things that I love about these landscapes when I look around are just how multi-layered they are and how there's so many different things happening, both from a plant level in terms of, big trees above and vines growing up them, and herbaceous ground cover plants all around, shrubs filling in the niches where sunlight is poking through. But not only that, but the different types of landscapes that are around there, whether they be wetland landscapes or dry glades on hillsides. We've got this opportunity to really study and see these interactions and some of the interconnectedness that I mentioned in the last slide at play. What does that look like? And I think it's really important for us to know what that looks like, because we have to understand what we're designing for. Where is our design inspiration? When we work with a client, the very first thing that the thing I want more than anything from a client is an inspiration board, because we have to know what target we're trying to hit when we're approaching landscape design. And so that's why I think these images, and these are more images from Shaw, I think that's why these images are so key, because they help us to understand where we want to aim our design. And I think that it's so fascinating, and I just can't get over these very simple questions, um, that when we look around in an environment like this, we know inherently, and nobody needs to teach us, like, these environments are lush and green and productive. They're producing so many calories. We may not be eating those calories directly from Shaw Nature Reserve, but there is abundance there, and there is an undeniable need for us to figure out how we as humans can fit into abundant landscapes like this. And I think these questions that are in these like thought bubbles of, where is fertility and irrigation coming from, and what, can we, like, where is anybody coming through here with pesticides and herbicides and things of that nature? And I think we all intuitively know the answer is no. So why have we struggled so much in our agriculture to create landscapes that are this productive, this resilient, this regenerative? And it's important to maybe define the idea of regenerative a little bit, which is the idea that there is no outside fertilizer per se. There is no outside inputs that necessarily make an ecosystem like this thrive. It has all the pieces built into it from the beginning, and thus it is getting stronger and stronger and more productive, oftentimes as the years go on, or ever since succession kind of began. And as long as it's managed with love and care, it's going to remain really productive, and potentially even increasing in productivity. And that's what really this regenerative idea is all about, is we don't need to set the clocks back to zero each year. A landscape like this is a brilliant and fascinating way of gardening, but it does set the clock back to zero each year. And every year that we think about a wonderful planting like the Three Sisters garden, we are tilling up the soil, creating a new planting bed for baby plants and baby seeds. And I imagine many of you are familiar with this planting technique, and don't get me wrong, I utilize it, and I think that the ideas behind it are clearly time tested, because so many of the indigenous populations of the Americas practiced this same technique, or I should say, created this technique. The cool thing about this, and why we just made the jump to this slide, is because what we have here is a polyculture. We have 3 different types of plants: the corn, the beans, and the squash, and they're intermingling and they're doing their thing, right? And the way that they work is so brilliant, because we've got this corn that takes advantage of vertical space, growing up nice and tall, and we've got the beans running around and climbing up on top of the corn. And then we've got this ground cover plant of the squash, keeping the soil moist and filling in all the niches in between all the corn and beans. And it's this harmony, right? And I think a lot of us can break down these 3 plants, understand how beautifully they work together, and we can understand that this is more than the sum of its parts. When we plant these things together, when we create a polyculture of multiple plants growing together, we can create something more productive, more harmonious than if we were to plant these things separately in different areas. So the way that we start to extrapolate that out and start to understand, how can we take that idea and start to bring it into the Shaw Nature Reserve landscape? And I think that the way that we can start to, evolve the Three Sisters garden and maybe start to see how we could move from something like the Three Sisters, which a lot of us might very well understand, to something a little bit more complex. And permaculture has helped popularize this idea of the fruit tree guild, or really just a guild. So what's a guild? A guild is basically an idea of a centerpiece, calorie producing tree, whether that be a fruit tree or a nut tree, and then all the different support species around the tree that provide different functions, right? So a lot of times you all, as gardeners, you might very well be familiar with the idea of a companion plant, right? So a companion plant might be basil with your tomatoes, or it might be marigold at the, at the end of the row of squash that you planted. Those are companion plants. And with the fruit tree guild, what we're basically looking at is all kinds of different companion plants, a whole host of them planted around a central feature. And in this case, the central feature is oftentimes going to be a fruit tree when we look at foodscaping possibilities. Then we've got all these other different kind of plants growing around it, right? And the reason this is so key is because what this does is it breaks down everything we were looking at in those Shaw slides. What are we looking at here, right? If we want to create that, we've got to break it down into its individual parts and start to understand what those different, what the different functions of all those plants are. So the idea of a guild, it kind of breaks them out and it says, this is what a healthy ecosystem looks like, right? We've got main fruit producing trees. We've got plants all around them that are covering the ground, making sure that, the ground is always covered. And then we've got all these other plants providing different functions. Maybe some of them are good for creating biomass and creating mulch on the spot. Maybe some of them are great at attracting pollinators. Maybe others are, fixing nitrogen, creating fertility out of the air that we breathe. And maybe, others are shade tolerant foods. And it's really important that we understand this because this is kind of the building block for a lot of the rest of this presentation, which is going to be talking about plants. We want to understand that we need a template, right? We've got this is kind of the template that we're going for. And then as we learn about plants, we can start to plug in the plants that make sense in the template for what we want to grow and for what is going on climatically. Permaculture is all about observation. And once we observe what's going on the land and what part of the world we live in and where water flows, we can make even more informed decisions about what plants make sense. So the question in the top right hand corner here, right? What's the life cycle of these plants? That's my way of asking, what types of plants are these? Are these annuals? Are they biennials? Are they perennials? Right? So these plants that we're looking at and all the plants in the Shaw Nature Reserve stuff, almost all those plants are perennials. And what that means is they come back year after year. And oftentimes, not only do they come back year after year, but they come back more vigorous and with greater abundance each year after they're planted. The Three Sisters, an awesome planting technique. Yes, in your annual garden, it doesn't do that, right? Those plants die. And at the end of the year, they're annuals, and then they need to be replanted each year. So the idea with permaculture, right, is nature-inspired design. And if we're trying to get as close to that as possible, to the resilience, abundance, and diversity that we find in well-managed areas like Shaw, then we need to focus on perennial plants because that's what is being shown to us as the foundational plants for an intergenerational regenerative ecosystem, the kind of agriculture that we would want to pass on to our children and our grandchildren. And That's not to say we shouldn't have vegetable farms or vegetable gardens, but I think that if there's anything permaculture is teaching us, it's teaching us that um, we need to notice what does nature want to do, and if we walk away from a plot of land, it is inevitably in short order going to become full of perennial plants after the annual plants have quickly um, come in. So we really want to focus on these perennial plants, right? But then we've got this balance. All right, we've got you know, the dream would be to have Shaw Nature Reserve in all of our backyards, right? That would be my dream, at least. But that can't happen, right? And I don't even know that it needs to happen. I think that a lot of these landscaping strategies that we're all familiar with, like things like hedgerows and specimen trees, ground covers, all these things, these are all things that we recognize as important niches in the landscape and places that we are going to want to design for in the urban and suburban context that we all are living in each day. And the question is, how do we start to blend these things? At least this is the question I'm trying to answer. And I certainly don't feel that I have it figured out completely. And it's all a huge experiment, I think, how we can get from that kind of regenerative abundance of Shaw and create the kind of landscapes that we all want to live in. I think that it is, if there's anything that is going to get us on the right track, it's understanding the plants that make this work possible. And we're going to kind of walk through a lot of the plants that I feel are our best allies in making this happen. I'm going to go through rather quickly, and this presentation will be recorded, and I know I'm happy to share this presentation as well. But we really need to understand, well, what are all these plants that we're looking at so that we can start to create this perennial abundance where, you know, so many of our clients, they often write in their vision statement that they want to be able to walk around and kind of just harvest things here and there, and they want to see flowers and pollinators on the plants, and they want to see birds, but more than anything, they want to be able to almost like forage from their landscape. You know, go pick some fruit, go snap some asparagus spears, go, you know, pick some perennial greens for their salad. Not that it's an intensive vegetable garden, but it's more of a leisurely experience and more of a park-like experience. And that is where these perennial plants come in so key. So let's jump in. This is got to be the one that I want to lead off with, because it's such an incredible tree. The Pawpaw, if you're not familiar with it, I highly encourage you checking it out. But this is our native custard banana. This is native to this part of the world, and it creates a fruit that is like a mango and a banana crossed. It's this beautiful broadleaf tropical looking plant that, as you can see in the pictures, it's a beautiful shaped tree, very nice, and it is very well suited to be planted in our yards. It's even well suited for the shade. You can plant it in sun, you can plant it in shade, but it will do much better. It will produce significantly more in the sun. But our Pawpaw is a gift that I think we see in the woods all around us, and luckily there are all kinds of improved varieties. Now, these improved varieties, like any native food, they are bigger and sweeter and less seedy and more productive and earlier to produce. They have all these desirable characteristics, and thus they have been selected and named. So there's the Susquehanna Pawpaw, and there's dozens of other Pawpaw varieties. These are the types that we plant in foodscape contexts because we're growing food. We want a yield. We want a predictable yield, and we want a really good one. So we've got, on the other end of the spectrum, we've got uncommon fruits that are not from this part of the world. One of the ones that we love is the Jujube. The Jujubes are a really neat ornamental fruit tree that tastes like a freeze-dried apple, and it is incredibly medicinal. If you walk the streets in any kind of like Chinatown setting, I've always found that they're selling dried jujubes, and it's an incredibly well-known crop in China. But here, it is very little known, and part of that being little known is nice because it means that it really hasn't had much time to develop pests or diseases. Those might come down the road, but for now, this is a really well-suited crop for our climate. It is fast growing, it is early producing, it is thorny, which might be seen as a good thing, might be a bad thing, depends on what you're going for. But they're weeping and they're quite beautiful, and I highly recommend checking out the jujubes as potential apple options. Another interesting one from China is called the Che tree, or sometimes we call it the watermelon berry tree. This is another one that fits a lot of the context that we're looking for with custom foodscaping, which is being ornamental. Very little pest and disease that are common, and nice looking foliage. This one is a mulberry and fig relative, and is a really nice looking tree. Oftentimes the shape of it lends itself really well to the landscape, kind of like the pawpaw that I mentioned. And the fruits are kind of like big, firm raspberries, as you can see in the picture. They're really nice and big. Now, a very similar size tree and maybe a very similar looking fruit are these sour cherries, or I should call them pie cherries, because the pie cherry is another wonderful tree that is oftentimes very easy to grow and super productive, with fruits that, without any kinds of sprays, oftentimes they will produce a really nice looking crop of fruits in our climate. And they're often pretty short trees. There are a handful of varieties like North Star that are easy to grow, and they stay within picking range, as you can see in this picture. So as we're going through here, right, let's not lose track of the fact that we're thinking about those landscaping strategies. We're thinking about that Shaw Nature Reserve stuff, and how we're that's the context for these trees, right? We have some wonderful persimmons that we can grow in our climate. Now, persimmon is the sweetest fruit we can possibly grow in our climate, but there's one big issue with persimmons, or maybe there's two, I should say. The one for foodscaping context is that the native persimmon tree is quite tall, and oftentimes the foliage looks pretty ratty, especially in the fall. So they don't lend themselves very well to landscape plantings. But luckily, the Asian persimmon that is planted in Korea and China and in Japan, those persimmons, which are related but quite different, they're incredibly ornamental. So there have been a handful of crosses where the American and the Asian persimmon have been crossed, and mostly what they're breeding for is cold hardiness of Asian persimmons. And luckily, what we've gotten out of that is a handful of hybrids where we've got genetics from both, and they produce really nice persimmons, much bigger oftentimes than the American persimmons we find in the wild. Nonetheless, the American persimmons, there are many delicious, fabulous varieties of American persimmon, but so if you have a bigger landscape, I would highly encourage you to plant them. But some of these varieties, like these hybrids, like Nikita's Gift has been the one we've been planting for years now and has done really well. That one is quite ornamental. That's the one that we see pictured in this picture here. Things like Asian pears are really productive. If you're thinking about pears and apples, I would highly encourage you to go think about Asian pears. They are like the Jujube, they're fast growing, they're early producing, and they produce a massive harvest. A lot of times these can actually be stored all through the winter too. So they just have endless benefits. And there's really only one big thing, which is this fire blight disease that plagues pears. And so with all pears, it's important to find fire blight resistant varieties. But besides that, they are quite easy to grow. So I would encourage you to look at the pears. So to kind of round out some of our main fruit trees, you know, I haven't talked about the main ones like the peaches and the apples and the pears. And I would encourage folks to grow their favorite fruits. A lot of these I adore, but a lot of them are susceptible to diseases. And disease is really one of the main things that makes, you know, food growing not fun. Is if we look around and we don't see, you know, healthy plants, then of course we're not likely to get a good harvest. So if you're looking at these fruits, be sure to do some homework and get disease resistant varieties, because many of these fruits have susceptibility to different diseases. So if you're going to plant them, then give yourself the best chance of success. Oh boy, one of my absolute favorites. Talk about going from the harder to grow fruit trees to the absolute easiest. The mulberry is the absolute easiest fruit tree we can grow. There is the native mulberry, which is awesome. There's the Morus rubra, but there's also been a lot of cultivars where the native mulberry has crossed with the white mulberry that we brought over for the silk industry back in the day. And the silkworm eats white mulberry leaves, and that's how they make their silk. And so then we ended up with all these hybrids of mulberries crossing the native rubra with the alba, and now we have a ton of different mulberry varieties, which are not the same mulberries you find growing in the cracks along your sidewalk and along your fence line. These are delicious, abundant mulberries, and a lot of them are white. So you can even get white mulberries that don't stain, because so many people are concerned with the staining nature of mulberries. Those white ones don't even stain, and the ones that do, the black ones, there's many varieties that make big fruits, especially sweet, and these are really fast growing trees. So I would highly encourage you to get on the mulberry train, one of my absolute favorites. And if you don't have a lot of space, the Girardi Dwarf Mulberry is a huge winner for us. This is one of our favorite specimen plants, along with like the Weeping Mulberry there. You know, as we're looking to design our landscapes, a lot of time we're looking for something that really is eye-catching in a specimen plant. And there's one, this Dwarf Mulberry is like a bush, only 6 or 7 feet tall and wide, and it's a really nice looking plant. And easy to pick, kind of like those bush cherries that we looked at earlier. This one is way easier to pick than a lot of other fruits that are way high up. So we've got other shrubs like the serviceberry or the Juneberry. This is probably the first fruit tree I would recommend anybody plant. Number one, the serviceberry or the Juneberry. These are multi-stem shrubs. They're kind of like small trees, and it is another native that's not really bothered by pest or disease. If you're not watching out, the birds will beat you to it. But if you are watching out, you will likely have a very abundant, easy harvest. And these are readily available at local nurseries already, which is great. The elderberry, that's another native that's absolutely phenomenal. So easy, probably the fastest growing plant and the easiest to propagate plant that I will talk about tonight. So if you're looking for any kind of hedge, or you've got a woodland forest edge type environment, highly recommend that elderberry. And you can easily take cuttings and share them with your friends as well. Another one that we adore that is a total showstopper and question asker is the Trifoliate Orange. This is the only hardy citrus that we can grow in our climate. And when I say grow, that means we can plant it in the ground and grow oranges. Now, those oranges are quite small and seedy, And there's definitely needs to be some breeding work still, I think, to get it to the point where we're beating out the oranges from Florida. But we can grow these, and they are contorted and thorny and weird as all get out, and really fun to look at. And the only important thing to know here is that they are not big, juicy, and sweet like the traditional orange. They're actually quite sour, which is great. They're much more like a lime or a lemon, and you can squeeze the juice out of them and use it just like you would the lime or lemon juice. And so if making, cocktails or dressings or other things with citrus is exciting to you like it is for me, then you're got to be all over the flying dragon. And who doesn't want to say flying dragon, trifoliate orange? It's just the most fun plant name. Oh boy, this is another big shrub winner. This is Ribes odoratum, the native clove currant. It makes delicious black currants. And this one has a profusion of yellow flowers. Pretty darn easy to grow. This one, highly rated edible landscape shrub layer plant here. Another one we adore is the fig. The fig might be the most beautiful foliage plant that I've ever planted. And the thing with figs is that they're not quite hardy enough in our area, but find a nice warm microclimate up against the south-facing brick wall or a protected environment with some rocks. And we just give it a bunch of straw bales and wrap the base every winter. We've got a bunch of videos on this if you're interested. And then you can overwinter your figs quite easily and still make sure that they produce. If you don't protect them in the winter, they'll die back to the ground and come back up from the roots. So they do need a little bit of work to protect, but they are worth all that effort. More in the bush and shrub realm are the cherries. Now, these bush cherries are early to produce, fast growing, and really some of our biggest winners. And so if you're thinking, well, I didn't know cherries grew on a bush, well, you're with the rest of us. Who knew? And they're actually some of the most fabulous landscape plants. So grow these bush cherries and forget the sweet cherries. I didn't even talk about the sweet cherries. Unfortunately, those are really hard to grow in our climate. So they're plagued with disease, and these bush cherries, which are different species of cherries, they don't have the same disease susceptibility as the regular sweet cherry trees. I'm going to kind of push forward a little bit here, just looking at the time. I want to be respectful of that. There's some really cool vines, easy to grow, like the hardy kiwi. Yes, we can grow kiwis in our climate. Just make sure that they have a nice big trellis to climb. And grapes. Many people don't know that grapes are actually native to our climate. There's like 7 kinds of native grapes to North America, but unfortunately, a lot of those are not the main grape varieties that get shared and propagated. But there are a lot of great grapes varieties out there, and that don't have the disease problems that so many of the common grapes have. That's the big issue with common grapes, is disease. And with that said, we had the trees and we had the shrubs, and now we're getting into some of the low growers, right? So what's covering the ground all the way at the ground? And we've got things like strawberries. Strawberries have got to be my favorite. I mean, they spread all over the place, create the most delicious fruits, and you dig them up, give them to your friends, and they're so cheap to source. For you got a $10 bill in your pocket, you can get strawberries for a lifetime. The other thing that I love about strawberries is that they have this alpine variety. That's one of our absolute favorites. That's in the bottom left-hand corner. Those are non-spreading strawberries. If you need to do some edging or bordering, or you've got a place you don't want strawberries to spread, check out alpines, because I've got to say, I think the alpine's the most delicious fruit we can grow in our climate. And then as we start to fill out our forest garden, or our landscape inspired by Shaw. We've got to better understand some of the forageable crops, right? We've got to we plant our fruit trees and such and our fruiting shrubs, but what about all the stuff that we're grabbing and snacking on, right? There are a lot of very little known perennial vegetables that we can be growing in our gardens and landscapes. Golden glow is one of them. I think that's Rudbeckia laciniata, and that's a Rudbeckia or a black-eyed Susan family plant that has edible leaves every spring. You know, so many of the edible perennial vegetables have edible leaves. Golden glow is one of them. Big leaf aster is another one that is a aster that makes these big leaves, and as the spring shoots come up, just like with golden glow, you can eat the leaves. Prickly pear. I mean, who would have thunk it, but the prickly pear is native to our environment. You can go or walk, take a hike and look at a glade area, open sunny spot. You're very well likely might see the prickly pear, which has edible pads and edible fruits, and they spread, and they got no pest or disease issues. They're easy peasy, right? And as we get into the shade, it gets a little bit tougher, right? But there's some phenomenal snackable, delicious crops for the shade. Hostas are my absolute favorite that very few people know about, gaining popularity, but the shoots that come up from the hosta plant are really quite delectable and abundant. You know, if you've ever seen a big, well-established hosta plant coming up out of the ground, you'll see there's a lot of foliage coming up there, and every one of those shoots is like an asparagus frond, you know, the equivalent. You can bring it inside and steam it. Other shoots that are fantastic, that are all, these are all shade lovers and all shoot vegetables. The ostrich fern, which makes the fiddleheads that you may have seen in restaurant photography, wondering, well, how the heck do I get a fiddlehead fern on my plate? Well, you just go plant some ostrich ferns and then they grow. Other native that's fantastic beside the ostrich fern is Solomon seal. This is a little bit harder to source, I find, but it is another beautiful woodland crop that makes edible shoots. And then finally, there's Udo or Aurelia. It's Aurelia cordata. That is there's a new variety that came out. It was named Plant of the Year, actually, for ornamental landscaping last year, called Sun King, Sunking, Sun King there. And that is, for those of you who are struggling with spelling of Sun King, don't know why I spelled that out. But this is a really newly available one because it won Plant of the Year. It seems to be widely spread, and so check out that one. And then we've got these low growers that are fabulous for just filling in all over the place. You know, things I love to just snack and add to every dish. If you're like me and you like, you know, onions and garlic and everything you eat, then you probably want chives and garlic chives all over your yard for their edible leaves and edible flowers. And the same thing with the violets. The violets are for whatever reason, people call them a weed. I call them the gift that keeps on giving. The edible leaves and edible flowers, and violets are a low growing ground cover that seems to grow everywhere, that is sun adapted, shade adapted. Stick it in, it don't care. Violets are a dream come true if you're looking to go snack a salad from outside. And then two really common landscape plants few people know are edible are the daylily. Every part of the daylily is edible. The roots, the shoots, the flowers, the flower buds. The flower buds are a favorite. Before the flowers open up, a lot of people eat those. And then sedum, these like long stem sedums, a lot of them people might be familiar with autumn joy, which is a common one. These are easy to grow, easy to propagate, and the leaves are edible on those too. And you can add those into salads, and they're pretty darn good. And then as you're filling things in, right, the other things you're going to just mix in if you're looking to get started this year is herbs. Herbs are just where it's at. The perennial herbs like thyme and sage and oregano and anise, hyssop, they'll help fill in all those niches for you when you're trying to create that foodscape that looks as much like the that Shaw Nature Reserve that we're going for, right? I know I kind of need to start winding down here, but there's even more perennial delicious edibles that these come back every year. You know, there's Turkish rocket and sea kale. These are perennial vegetables. You plant them once, they come back every year and they make little broccolis. There's perennial ginger, which is a beautiful perennial that looks like the tropical ginger that we all know, but comes back every year and makes a edible flower crop. And while you're out there, of course, don't forget about our fungal friends, right? We know that out there in the forest, there's fungus growing everywhere. The mycelium is connecting everything, cleaning things, talking to each other. If you haven't had your mind blown with the possibilities of growing mushrooms around all these plants, I would highly encourage you to get on YouTube and check out How to Garden with Mushrooms. North Spore put out this incredible video that I think is just the bee's knees, and it'll walk you through all the different ways you can be gardening with edible mushrooms. And to kind of wrap things up here, I want to just bring us back to kind of where we started, which is this permaculture approach and the recognition that as we design our landscapes and we take inspiration from the landscape design that we see around us, let us continue to draw inspiration from places like Shaw Nature Reserve that are creating so much abundance in a seemingly, you know, seamless and natural and beautiful way, and let us try to maybe think of the Fruit Tree Guild as our way of kind of interpreting some of what we see when we are gaining inspiration from a diverse, wild environment. Because I think that can help us make sense of some of that. Now, if you want to go out and get some more inspiration, you know, I've got some books that I just love. They were very inspiring for me, and some different nurseries that will allow you to get some of these plants. You know, the plants that I talked about they're all over the place. I wish there was one place I could send you that had everything, but you got to kind of poke around, and this will hopefully get you started. If you go to our website, customfoodscaping.com, there is a resources page there, and that'll give you some extra information on some nurseries and books and whatnot. But I will leave it there so that you guys can digest those books and nurseries, and I will say thank you so much for the opportunity to share, and I look forward to answering some questions here. So Jackson, let's do it.
All right, great. We have quite a few. So I think it seems like a lot of people are interested in knowing definitely about kind of pest deterrents and specifically deer. So I'd say first, a couple questions on our pawpaws. Do you find any deer resistance, or just do deer like pawpaws?
My understanding, and I would never say that something is 100% deer proof, but for the most part, pawpaws are not eaten by deer. That is, they're like the exception to the rule.
Yeah, that's a good point. Nothing is truly 100% deer resistant. Do you have any tips, or so some people were talking about squirrels and raccoons and they've had trouble with them eating their fruits. Is there any techniques or types of fruits that you find that they don't go after?
Oh gosh, it's tough. It is so tough. I feel like, you know, we got to constantly be experimenting. I do not have great resources. You know, I've Googled all this, everything, and I'm experimented with a bunch of things, and I don't feel like anything is like a surefire thing that I can go on record saying will work. I will say that I find that lower water fruits tend to be better. So things that are not super juicy, like persimmons, jujubes, pawpaw, are easier to grow. Generally, they're left alone more by those mammals, as well as the berries. You know, a lot of times like those clove currants, and blackberries and raspberries for that matter, you know, a lot of times those things are not eaten by the squirrels.
Got a bunch coming in, so I'm scrolling back down. Oh, there was another one. Dun, dun, dun. Oh, yeah, we have a couple people asking about soil prep, definitely in the city.
Good question.
Yeah, do you have any tips or anything like that on
Yeah,
that?
I actually would say there's no one way to do it. You got to dig around. Like the best soil test you can do is the shovel test. You know, a lot of times intuitively we know what good soil is like. Like good soil is dark and crumbly and full of, you know, worms and things. And if all you're hitting is just straight rubble and lots of, you know, terrible backfilled clay, then it's really important to bring in some improved soil. But generally, you know, I've been amazed at like, if you can dig a hole and plant the tree, like if you can make that happen, then your tree is likely to grow. I have seen some really poor soil prep done, and still trees did quite all right. But I can say that only anecdotally, and that I've also seen a lot of trees not grow very well. So with that said, we generally, you know, as foodscapers, we are bringing in improved soil a lot of times and putting it on top of the existing soil, depending on what the situation is. That might be 3 inches, it might be 8 inches. And then we're bringing in lots of good mulch ground cover on top of that, and then spraying all that with compost tea inoculant to make sure that we get beneficial biology happening in that area. And I should also say, actually, the idea of what we call forking the soil, which is basically like opening it up, not turning it over, not tilling it, but just sticking the shovel in the ground and rocking that soil open so that it cracks, is a key to activating soil life. Because once water can get in there, then air can get in there, and then where water and air are, soil biology live. So it kind of you know, it's the Kickstarter for the whole cycle, is getting that soil opened up a little bit.
Yeah, I do want to, yeah, I think also I see some comments about lead, and while us in St. Louis are, heavy metal contamination is a concern. Uptake into a lot of fruiting plants is pretty low. And really your biggest concern is interacting with the soil, is with lead contaminated soil is the biggest concern. So I know MU Extension here in Missouri does pretty low cost soil tests. Some people are asking about, oh, a quick question. Do pawpaws in this area need to be hand pollinated?
No, but you can only increase the pollination by, if you do hand pollinate. And pawpaws generally are a little bit finicky pollinators. So a lot of times we plant pawpaw groves, like a grouping of 3 together, and 3 different varieties, 3 different sets of genetics. And that really, if planted in close proximity, and I think that we're doing a pretty decent job of mitigating risk that there's not going to be pollination there.
Some people are talking about they've got some large trees on their properties already.
Yeah.
But they're interested in putting in some other like smaller trees or plants. Any ones that you had in the presentation that you recommend?
Under trees?
Yeah, some.
Oh yeah, man. So many of these shade plants are like plants like these, highly recommend. Sometimes it can be really hard to even, you know, get some of these plants in the ground. So man, like some of the like the violets I love, and daylilies, like those are, the violets and the daylilies particularly are really tolerant of lots of other plants growing around them, and they have these little like root nodules. If you can just get that little tuber or that little root nodule buried a little bit, it'll root down and take and start spreading. So and if you have, you know, the ability to dig in a little bit, yeah, I think some of these low growers in the shade these are some of our most commonly planted shade crops.
All right, great. And then, yeah, so some people are asking about kind of like weed control. And we do have a question about, do you use for mulching, do you prefer like a wood chip versus like a wood mulch or a straw? Or do
My
you?
favorite mulch is usually whatever the cheapest or freest mulch is that you have available. You know, mulch is ultimately going to break down, and it's all organic matter. And every time you cover the soil, whether it's with leaves or wood chip mulch or shredded bark mulch, whatever, like you're going to invite a lot of the soil food web members that we want to be living in there to the root zone. And a lot of times that's my preferred mulch. But if you are going to go to the, you know, yard to buy some mulch at a place like St. Louis Composting or something, then we usually just get like the organic mulch or what's called the natural mulch, and it's got all different shapes and sizes. Ultimately, we want more texture, you know, in mulch. We want it to be big pieces, small pieces, and all kinds of places for different fungi and insects to live.
I don't want to, we've got a lot of questions that I think go a little too deep, would be almost a whole nother class on. We do have a couple questions. I don't know if you defined, but could you do a quick little explanation of microclimate?
Great question. Yeah. A microclimate is a climate within your context that is unique. So a microclimate might be under your porch. You know, under your porch, it might be particularly shady and wet, and it might be cool. So that would be a microclimate that, although it's on your property in St. Louis, Missouri, in Zone 6B, it may be nothing like anywhere else on your property. And so we need to choose how to handle it totally differently. And so that would be considered a microclimate. It's one of the many mini climates that exist in a given space.
Great. I think some people are interested in seeing the books. If you could move to that slide, or a couple questions on those, just seeing them. I'm going to take, got about enough time for maybe 2 more questions. So are there any good smaller size nut trees for the area?
Yes. The best one is probably the hazelnut, which is a native nut shrub, if you will. And there are also a few hardy almond varieties that don't get too big. After almonds, the best one is probably the Chinese chestnut, which does get about 30 feet tall, but it's a great landscape tree and is probably maybe the easiest to grow of the nuts for some different reasons. But yeah, I wish we could grow more nuts in our yards. That would be awesome, but it's not easy because a lot of those trees, the ones that want to grow in our climate, like walnuts and pecans, are really big.
Last question that somebody's just asking for a kind of specific recommendation. They're for smaller urban spaces that they can't really plant 2 of the same variety. What do you have any like specific recommendations of like 1 or 2 trees to get the most out of? We talked about this in grafting a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. So there's 2 options. One is to plant multi-grafted trees or to learn how to graft. Basically, an apple is not self-fertile. It won't pollinate itself. But if you get an apple with 3 different varieties on it, then you've got 1 apple tree, but you don't need cross-pollinating friends. So just get a multi-grafted or cocktail tree. That's one option. Another option is to plant self-fertile things like the che tree and the the pie cherry and other things like the fig, a lot of things are self-fertile. You don't need another friend to pollinate them. So you can focus on those plants.
Awesome. Great. All right. I'm going to stop the recording.